Today's session is called Navigating Rooftop Solar Across Canada. We were delighted to have so many people register for this event. Please note that we will be recording this webinar for future distribution. My name is Preet Kang and I am the board president for Solar Alberta. I would like to take a minute to acknowledge that I am hosting you today and working day-to-day from Amaskwaci, Waskahikan, also known as Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homelands of the Métis Nation. Treaty 6 territory is a traditional gathering place and home of many Indigenous peoples, including the Papaches, Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Blackfoot, and Nakota Sioux. Nations whose ancestors have cared for and nurtured these lands since time immemorial. Today, we will be hearing about rooftop solar across Canada from Heather McKenzie, Brian Douglas, Erwin Hoyk, and James Rendell in a robust discussion format. Following the discussion, there will be a question and answer period in which you can all participate. The entire session will wrap up in an hour and a half. In an effort to increase accessibility, we have enabled closed captioning for this presentation. You can turn the captioning on in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. During our question and answer period, we will be using Zoom question and answer for questions rather than the chat box. So please enter your questions in this Q&A section. Also, please click on the little thumbs up symbol to upvote questions that you like. Before we move forward, we are going to do a quick poll to get a sense of who's joining us today. Please take a second to answer the question popping up on your screen right now. And while we are doing the poll, I also would like to encourage you to take a minute and pop your name, land acknowledgement, and any contact information you are comfortable sharing in the chat now and throughout the event so that others can look you up on LinkedIn or email you. A great way to form new relationships. Okay. So we're getting to know the audience. Are you solar curious? Are you a solar or related industry professional? It looks like there's a heavy number of solar curious and solar related industry professionals, about the same number, 47%. And others are industry students. That's awesome to see. Thank you so much for participating. It's always helpful to know a little bit about the audience before we dive in. And now for a little bit about Solar Alberta. Did you know Solar Alberta is in its 33rd year of operation? Albertans have been excited about solar energy for a while. We are a not-for-profit society that is dedicated to accelerating Alberta's transition to a just and sustainable energy future. We do so by advocating, educating, and serving as an industry and community hub for solar energy. Our membership is made up of over 750 individuals and over 160 businesses. We also have approximately 21,000 followers. We provide a number of services, including managing a solar directory through our website. In this way, we act as a bridge for installers, suppliers, and other solar-related businesses to connect with their customers and clients. You can see a screenshot of the directory here on the slide, and also a link will be provided to you in the chat. In addition to our website services, we run a number of educational programs, including our solar seminar series, and a number of in-person and online networking events each year. Our next Solar Series session will take place on April 25th at noon, and Farah Sharif of NRCan will discuss Canada's path to net zero. You can register to the link in the chat. Early each calendar year, we also host an online conference and trade show called the Solar Show. Recordings of our previous Solar Show sessions can be found on our Solar Alberta YouTube channel. This spring, we are running a number of online courses for solar industry professionals or those transitioning into the sector. Our courses are online Tuesday and Thursday evenings on 3 to 5 nights over 2 to 3 weeks. Our next course is Battery Energy Storage Systems Design and Modeling. You can register for all of our upcoming courses at the link provided also in the chat. Recordings of full slate of courses are also available for sale alongside our paid workshops in the solar training video section of the Solar Alberta website. In addition to providing education about solar, we also advocate for it. We are currently rising up for renewables. We have free lawn signs available for pickup in 11 municipalities around Alberta, and today is the last day for free delivery in select locations. We also have new template letters on our website asking the government of Alberta to eliminate the new and discriminatory buffer zones they have established for renewable energy. Your support with our advocacy efforts is very important. You can click on the chat. You can click on the link in the chat to make a sign order today. If you are not already, I encourage you to join Solar Alberta as a member. We are constantly evolving service member offerings, some of which include discounts on our courses and workshops, access to members-only content, and more. Individual membership is $35 and can also be purchased in the link in the chat. If you are looking to support the work that we are doing at Solar Alberta, please consider volunteering or donating. The link to be a general volunteer also in the chat, as well as links to our donation page. Solar Alberta members are invited to attend our 2024 AGM. We will be reviewing our year-end financial statements and annual report, and also be electing our board of directors. It will be held on April 24th, and members can register before April 3rd. At the AGM, we will be announcing our Lifetime Member Award recipients. If you know a solar champion in Alberta, consider nominating them on our website before April 3rd. We are pleased to announce the Solar Alberta Diversity Scholarship. This scholarship is intended for equity-deserving individuals. And through the scholarship, we are seeking to promote inclusivity, amplify historically marginalized voices, and encourage diverse participation in the solar and solar-related sector. We will award $2,000 to one equity-deserving individual registered in an Albertan training program that aligns with our mission. Applications are accepted until April 30th. Eligibility details and scholarship application are also available by clicking the link in the chat. We are thankful to Enbridge for sponsoring this scholarship. Now, without further ado, I would like to take this opportunity to give a shout out to Firefly Solar for sponsoring this year's seminar series as a whole. We couldn't offer all of this amazing free content without the support of our sponsors. We're always interested in developing more partnerships for our events. If you or your company want to work with us to educate the public about solar or solar-related technologies, please don't hesitate to reach out. Now, I'd like to welcome our speakers for the session. Heather McKenzie is the Executive Director of Solar Alberta, where she and her team are working hard to accelerate Alberta's transition to a just and sustainable energy future. She's a seasoned leader, community organizer, and green business advocate. Prior to becoming the Executive Director of Solar Alberta, she worked as a government relations professional, ran her own business, and served as an elected trustee on the Edmonton Public School Board. She's in the midst of completing a master's in public administration, has a master's in international development, and also has undergraduate degrees in both sociology and history. She believes that investing in solar is a very concrete way that everyday Albertans can take meaningful action on climate change. Brian Douglas serves on the British Columbia Sustainable Energy Association Board and leads the national sales team at Charge Solar. With over 18 years in the solar industry, Brian has contributed in areas from logistics to accounting to design and ultimately sales. He has served on CanSIA's board from 2016 to 2018 and advocated for solar policies at Ontario's Legislative Assembly. As a respected voice on solar programs and net metering's future in Canada, Brian is focused on working with Canada installers to continue to grow the solar PV industry. We are so grateful today that Brian could join us on behalf of the BCSEA and provide British Columbia's perspective. James Randall serves on the board of Solar Nova Scotia and is the Director of Operations at What's Up Solar Limited, a Nova Scotian company that specializes in solar PV and battery-based energy storage systems. To date, What's Up Solar has installed over 1,000 systems in the province and has witnessed the exponential growth of the green energy sector in real time. He has a background in geology and made the transition to green energy in 2019. Thank you so much, James, for joining us on behalf of our partners at Solar Nova Scotia, and thank you for providing context to Nova Scotia's solar sector. As CanRIA's Director for Saskatchewan and for Distributed Energy Resources, Erwin Hoyk leads to policy development and advocacy for wind, solar, and storage technologies in Saskatchewan and supports CanRIA's solar behind-the-meter and distributed energy resources efforts across Canada. He is a lifelong energy industry professional who has served as the Director of Facility Planning with the provincial gas utility Sask Energy until 2018, and then left to create and lead the Distributed Energy Association of Saskatchewan, also known as DEAS, from 2019 to 2022. In his various roles, he has supported the DER technology vendor dialogue with academia, municipalities, governments, and utilities, focusing on clean energy systems and development. Erwin holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Regina with an Industrial Systems Engineering designation. He is based in Regina. Wonderful. So nice to have all of you here today joining us and a diversity of perspectives and knowledge and skills. Let's get into the questions that were prepared. Okay. So my first question is, what are some of the trends for rooftop solar adoption on homes and businesses in your province? For example, Alberta has over 16,000 arrays on homes and businesses and has seen incredible growth in the last 3 years in particular. Please feel free to answer in whichever order you like. And I know that some of you also have a short presentation or a slide to show.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in because ever since we wrote those questions for you, Preet, our numbers kept going up. So I did want to show our most recent graph actually to kick things off. And then I think Brian had a couple graphs to show us as well. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to grab my graph here to show you a little bit about Alberta's growth recently. Okay. So what you see here is the total solar microgeneration in Alberta from 2014 to 2023. So that's mostly rooftop arrays, mostly on homes and businesses in this province. And in 2014, we only had about 5 megawatts of solar generated by approximately 1,000 microgenerators on the grid. And then by 2021, we had over 100 megawatts of generation capacity on the grid from about 6,000 homes and businesses in Alberta. And just 3 years later, which of course, as many of you know, coincides with a good chunk of the Canada Greener Homes grant and loan program, we now actually have over 225 megawatts of installed microgeneration capacity and went up to over 18,000 systems in just a couple months since we updated your notes there, Preet. So it's phenomenal to see the growth of the microgenerators in Alberta these days. Quite amazing. I'll turn my screen over to Brian now because I know he had some BC context to share.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, British Columbia shows a very similar trajectory on amount of solar uptake, although at smaller overall numbers. We're seeing roughly 2,100 new systems going on per year over the last 2 or 3 years. Total of 8,500 net metering customers and roughly 71 megawatts installed on the grid. That's as of October of last year. Those numbers are on the same uptick trajectory, which is really nice to see. We also have increased size of systems that are going in. If you go back to 2015, the average size was probably about 5.5 kilowatts. We're almost double that from an average size perspective of the sizes that are going in, up to an average installed net metering size of 9.5 kilowatt. And you'll see that a majority of this is in the residential market. 93% of the installs are residential, only 7% commercial. And then there's a diversity of the areas, leading the way in Vancouver Island with 47% of the net metering customers.
Well, I don't have any graphs to show you, but in 2018 there were about 200 systems installed in Nova Scotia, and kind of similar to BC, we're up to about 8,500. So similar exponential growth in the province.
That's really awesome to see. It is exponential growth across Canada, as we've seen in the different provinces that we're just shown graphs of. My next question is, what are the rules for behind the meter / microgeneration installations in your province? So for example, Alberta has the microgeneration regulation that allows for net billing, allows for solar specific pricing plans, and is oriented primarily towards on-site consumption.
Yeah. I'll maybe speak to Saskatchewan here. And I'll say that I don't have a graph for the level of activity, but Saskatchewan, interestingly, we've got the best solar resource in Canada, and we've got some pretty high rates in terms of our retail rates. So there's an attractive business model for it. We had a booming industry, I'll say back in 2019. We were doing in the order of approximately 10 megawatts per year, which is in the order of 1,000 installs. There was a change to the program, and I think one of the challenges here is a bit of a boom and bust. And we went from a net metering 1-to-1 to a net billing, which reduced the credit by about 50%, and that really took the wind out of the sails, I'll say, for the industry. Certainly, with the Greener Homes program, the industry is doing well. COVID didn't help, I think, the industry at all there, but I don't believe it's recovered to the level that it was at. We're still one of the few provinces here with net billing. I believe Manitoba is the only other jurisdiction with sort of that net billing, but it's a 50% credit. And I think it's maybe time to talk to the utilities and see whether that 1-to-1 net metering benefit is something that can be reinstated in support of the industry. But certainly the Greener Homes program has done a lot here in Saskatchewan to support the industry and help bring it back up to I'll say the levels close to where it was at back in 2019.
Yeah, I'll speak to British Columbia. So British Columbia is a pure play net metering 1-to-1 for the residential rate that you're paying. BC has a step price model where if you use over X amount of kilowatt hours in a month, you go to a higher tier of pricing. So our higher tier is around 14 cents. And the beauty of net metering is that you're shaving off the expensive kilowatt hours first off of net metering. So you shave off the top tier of on net metering. The downside of net metering in British Columbia is really just the capacity. So in Ontario, you have micro generating systems that can go all the way to 5 megawatts. Our cap is at 100 kilowatt in the in BC Hydro territory and 50 kilowatt maximum nameplate capacity in Fortis territory. So it's limiting to any commercial side of things. So.
Okay, so speaking for Nova Scotia, there was a major change in 2022. I could speak about the old program if you wanted, or just about the new program. What do you think?
Well, the new one's what's exciting right now, so feel free
Fair
to
enough.
tell us what you're dealing with right now. For sure is fine.
Okay, so we have something called the Self-Generation Offset Program, and it's a provincial regulation, Bill 145 of the Electricity Act, and it does three very important things. The first is that it gives everyone in Nova Scotia the right to install a system up to 27 kilowatts AC, which is more than the average residential household would need. The second one is that it makes kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour law. So whatever you pay for power, the utility must pay you the same rate for your power. And the third, it said, I'm paraphrasing here, but Nova Scotia Power cannot apply to the Utility and Review Board to do anything that would jeopardize a customer's investment in renewable energy. So although we don't have a contract, it's provincial law, which I think in certain senses is a more stable environment for solar.
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear. So it does sound like a couple of the differences are, even though we have a net billing system here in Alberta, which is kind of one-to-one, you pay what you get, it sounds like the fact that we can change that from season to season is a little bit unique here. So it's the solar specific pricing option in Alberta that seems to be a bit unique. So in the summer, when you're generating a lot, you can choose to pay a higher rate, and then you earn a higher rate of credit, which can offset some of those bills in the winter when you choose to pay a little less when you're earning a little less. And so that sounds very unique here, how we can shift our rate from season to season. And also it sounds like, Brian, what you were saying is our microgeneration regulation goes up to 5 megawatts, which is a big part of why I think the commercial sector is so prominent here in Alberta. We also had the Energy Savings in Business program, which was providing significant incentives for commercial folks to adopt solar here in the last few years. So I think that's really increased uptake on the business side of things. So very interesting, though, to learn that Nova Scotia has somewhat achieved already what we're advocating for here in Alberta, which is
I should mention there's a big caveat.
Yeah, I was like, where's the catch? Because we've been actually asking to remove the cap for folks who are on a 200 amp residential service or less. We would like to get that cap removed, and sounds like you've got that removed. So what is the caveat? Because that sounds really good.
The caveat is that at least under the residential self-generation offset program, you cannot produce more power than you use annually.
Oh, you do have the cap. Okay, so you can produce up to 27 if you're using up to 27, hey?
Correct, yes.
So it is the same cap here, yeah. Yeah, that's too bad, hey? We're frustrated by that. We would like to see that cap removed for the little guys. I understand the distributors are a bit hesitant to remove that cap for the larger microgen systems, but it feels like for the little folks, we could probably accommodate an unlimited export scenario, which we already have in Alberta for industrial sites. So it's a shame that the homeowners are left out of that.
I would probably disagree there. I quite like the, take yourself off the board mentality of Nova Scotia. When you start to make a profit, then you've got business insurance for residential households, and you've got tax implications that we get to avoid by not doing that. I think someone else could probably speak more eloquently about this, but Ontario had a similar program called Microfit back in 2012, I think it was. And if I'm not mistaken, they offered something like 80 cents a kilowatt hour as a power purchase agreement, which is almost too good to be true.
Well, in 2008 as the start of the microfit program, and it was up to 82 cents a kilowatt hour, but it was not exactly the same. You were an independent power producer using a separate meter going directly to the grid. So you had 2 meters. You had your home consumption meter coming in from the grid, and you had a power production meter for every kilowatt that was being produced on your roof. And yeah, there were tax implications just as any other income side of things. I'm kind of on your same logic though, James, but for maybe a different reason. I think that if you have a hard cap on export annually to try to right size your system annually, the programs will be seen as non-combative with the utility, and it would be if they don't have to cut a check to a whole bunch of different residential people, then the program will last longer and it will be less combative at the utility rate. I know in Saskatchewan they just don't give you any of your excess power back at the end of the year. My only catch between that is I'd like to see a program that if you are overproducing, that you'd be able to potentially donate that power to a school or a hospital or something like that as a donation for your over consumption, and maybe not be given a check, but be given a taxable a tax credit for being able to give that as an offset value to somebody in the community that needs it. So that would be my able to thread the needle between overproduction on your own home and not overproduction on your own home. So
That's an
Sounds like a good
interesting.
idea.
It's an interesting perspective, Brian. Like I was thinking about why we hear about this so much here. Like it's absolutely the number one complaint by far that we hear about in Alberta is just the frustration with the cap on export for microgenerators that just drives everybody bonkers. But I see what you're saying. It can help you avoid a bit of tension there. I wonder if once you reach a critical mass of microgenerators, whether you can overcome that tension just simply through sheer numbers. And at some point you can put the climate first and forget about that tension, and allow folks to have a secondary household income. I would love to see the numbers on the tax though, because that is a factor that I hadn't heard about. It would probably be similar in my mind to someone running an Airbnb out of their home. They're having this secondary household income. I wonder if the taxes would be comparable to something like that as a household business.
You raise a good point, and I think when you look at the utility scale model of renewable energy, and the opposite end of the spectrum is the residential sort of delivery model, and all the spaces in between, in terms of industrial scale, commercial scale, community scale, and ultimately residential scale. I think that the challenge is how utility like in terms of compensation does the residential model look like, and where is that sort of demarcation between the ability to participate in the wholesale market in terms of the aggregation of the opportunity and the simplicity to the administration of it by the utility or by the distribution system operator. So it's almost like a grayscale where utility scale is black and residential scale is white, and where does that sort of crossover in similar revenue opportunities exist as a function of the scale and location of those technologies. I think that's an interesting discussion, and I think jurisdictions are sort of trying to work that out. So.
Yeah, the other thing I'll touch on is just from the utility and how we can help or be seen as combative with the utility. We kind of use the US as a crystal ball. A lot of these rules that are being put in place are for when there's substantially more market penetration of solar. Right now, the Canadian average is 0.2%. Alberta's higher, maybe 2% of market penetration. But a lot of the rules are in place for if we get to a 30 or a 40% market penetration, and the utility has to cut a massive amount of payback back to the industry, and also has to deal with overproduction in the middle of the day and base load issues at the end of the day when people come home, plug in their electric vehicles, and turn on their stoves. It's called the duck curve, which California has had to work through, right? So we want to be seen as symbiotic with the utility and not as a parasitic issue with the utility. So some of the rules that they're putting in place are trying to make sure that we don't get to the level that it got so extreme and hyper adoptive climates like California and Hawaii, where they see this overproduction and this duck curve on their utility. So we do have to think long term from a strategy perspective, and to make sure that they don't have some knee-jerk reactions like no export is allowed, period, or you have to have storage. Like these are some things that some other utilities have implemented in the United States. So we are open to hearing what their issues are from the utility to make sure that we are aligned with them long term.
Mm-hmm. And it's good that you mentioned the storage, because I do think that's going to be a component going forward as we expand that system. I was thinking too, though, that a lot of folks think about the cost, but what they don't talk about is how they're essentially allowing a whole bunch of individual people to invest their own personal finances in greening our grid and in climate action. And so I always like to think about the cost savings when you're just enabling a whole bunch of folks to actually invest their own money in climate action instead of having the state do it all. So I guess I'm a glass half full kind of gal, but I hear where you're coming from, Brian. Sorry, Preet, I cut in there.
Oh, no, it's all good. It's such an interesting conversation and observations from solutions happening in different jurisdictions that we can learn from and compare what we're doing. Let's move to the next question. What organizations are involved in permitting rooftop solar installation projects in your province? James, would you want to?
Sure. Nova Scotia Power is not only the utility, they're also the electrical authority. So solar installations are subject to a Nova Scotia plans review. In some cases, there's building permits. That's about it, really. Certain incentives and rebates do require extra oversight from organizations like Efficiency Nova Scotia, but it's more or less fairly simple.
Yeah, I think we're kind of the outlier here. Hey, everybody else is just doing a Crown Corp sort of situation. I think it seems like Alberta's kind of unique with all our different distributors. So for those of you who aren't from Alberta who are in attendance today, you know, we have a lot of different distributors here. If you're in Edmonton, of course, your wire provider is EPCOR. If you're in Calgary, it's ENMAX. Rural Alberta, it's typically Fortis or ATCO. Occasionally there's a Rural Electrification Association, or Medicine Hat does their own thing. Fort Chipewyan does their own thing. So we have a lot of different distributors here who are all in charge of monitoring and approving based on Alberta's microgeneration regulations. So they essentially operate as the regulator on behalf of the government of Alberta, and a little different than the Crown Corp situation. And then of course we have some municipal hoops to jump through. I recently learned that apparently ground mounts aren't allowed on residential in Edmonton. I was like, oh, here I live, and I didn't know that. So that was quite intriguing. I don't know if I haven't verified that, but that was interesting because, of course, in a lot of rural Alberta, folks might opt for a little ground mount array, especially if they can build their own. A lot of do-it-yourselfers like to build their own ground mount. But apparently that's a no-go here. So definitely some municipal hoops to jump through as well. And we're kind of fortunate at Solar Alberta. We have a number of members who actually serve as consultants to support folks in and jumping through whatever hoops they need to. So a lot of our installers provide that service. But if folks are working on commercial or even going bigger and doing solar farms, we also have consultants who help folks with kind of our own little red tape reduction strategy here at Solar Alberta. But yeah, Brian, Erwin, are the other provinces sort of similar to how James was describing?
Nova Scotia is unique in that the utility is also the inspection authority, which does cause some potential conflicts of interest in off-grid reviewing and things like that. So I'm sure James is aware there's some battery-based systems that are being failed in Nova Scotia that really shouldn't be. But the British Columbia has it's, you have to go through the standard net metering application with either Fortis or BC Hydro. We only have two utilities. Then your inspection bodies are generally the Electrical Safety Authority, come in to sign off on your electrical side of things. But we have so many sub-regions that some areas don't have an Electrical Safety Authority. So the term AHJ, or Authority Having Jurisdiction, is common in both British Columbia and in Ontario, that have an area where maybe the fire department is the authority having jurisdiction over that in that region, to make sure that you're adhering to code in an off-grid application or that sort of thing. So it does vary depending on where you are, but generally standard. The only thing that I'll say that British Columbia is fairly either unique or more stringent on is seismic applications for flat roof. So if you're trying to do a flat roof solution using ballasted situation, you can do all their math, and they're still going to require you to have anchor points on that roof to make sure that in an earthquake that the product is not going to slide and move to a different area on the roof. So you do have to be careful in British Columbia if you're doing a flat roof install.
That's
Yeah.
so interesting, and it sounds like you have a lot more off-grid in BC than we would have in Alberta, hey? Because I think that's a pretty tiny part of our system here, hey?
Yeah, Alberta and Saskatchewan have a lot of gridded areas, whereas British Columbia and Ontario have quite a bit of regions where it financially makes no sense to bring in a $50,000 line to a cabin that you could offset with $20,000 worth of solar equipment over the lifespan of the product. So yeah, the off-grid market, there's off-grid communities, there are entire islands that have no power being brought to them. There's regions that have different jurisdictional issues.
I think that's certainly one of the challenges with Saskatchewan, is that communities that historically have been served. Now, when it comes time to actually replace that infrastructure, they're finding that they need to start entertaining microgrid solutions. Saskatchewan's metric for customers per kilometer of infrastructure is 3. And I compare that to an NMAX that serves the same number of customers, and their metric is 130 customers per kilometer of infrastructure. So certainly there's some challenges. The inspection used to be through the utilities here, through the Crown Corporation. And a number of years back, probably about 5-6 years ago, they moved to a technical safety authority that actually does all the electrical and gas inspections on behalf of the Crowns there. So that is now done under a separate authority. The system integration study, if you're looking at residential solar, is still obviously done by the utility. The model here is SaskPower provides that for the province. Saskatoon Light and Power is its own distribution utility within Saskatoon. And there's Swift Current Light and Power, which are sort of legacy distribution utilities back from the, I'll say, 30s when SaskPower was formed. They elected to stay independent. The interesting thing for me is the integration study cost. Some are free and some require, substantial dollars to do that integration study. I think the other thing is again, the homeowners not just paying for their solar system, but also paying for things like the bi-directional meter and some of those assets as well, which, is interesting in terms of should the utility be rate basing that versus taking a customer contribution from the customer. So.
Yeah, I know here in Alberta, of course, the bidirectional meter is free for the microgenerator, and that is rate-based. And of course, one of the ways that some of the distributors are dealing with that is actually just to put in smart metering for everybody. So they're actually saying, hey, why don't we just do that across the board and make everything smarter? So that's a nice solution where everybody's getting a smarter meter, which will hopefully serve us well in the future. I was curious if any of you have heard, the other day I was in Castor, Alberta, where they have had their first rooftop array be introduced. So just like Saskatchewan, a lot of our towns here are very small. Obviously, so sometimes there are a lot of firsts happening in Alberta right now. And this first residential solar install there, she was actually required, before she could even get approval to move forward, a letter had to go out to everyone who lived around her asking if they were okay with her having solar. And that was quite fascinating because, in Edmonton, no way would my neighbors get to have an opinion on that. So I know the Municipal Climate Change Action Center has put out a sort of a solar-friendly municipalities guide to help solar-friendly municipalities kind of reduce that red tape. But have you folks seen that kind of process anywhere in your work where you've come across the requirement for all of the neighbors to approve for someone to get 5 kilowatts on their home?
No.
Definitely not for a 5 kilowatt. There are community impact studies on, you know, farms, and if it's near an airport, or there's certain things for commercial solar that have had to go in. And then there's all the building permit issues where I've seen a system get failed because it was 2 inches over the maximum building height when you have installed it on top of the roof, right? So there are some municipal rules and regulations that you have to get around that are unique, and it's potentially built into their municipal you know, code that you have to have community input for X, Y, or Z. But I have not run into that. So
Yeah, it definitely seemed like it a bit of an anomaly. But I think obviously every time there's a first in a community, then folks have to kind of go through a process once and then decide, oh, okay, maybe we don't need to do a glare analysis on every rooftop array in the house in town. But I guess these are growing pains, so it's good to hear that you're not seeing a lot of that.
yeah, and further to that, in the opposite direction, there are building departments that have accepted sloped roof as not requiring building permits in a lot of different jurisdictions, where there'll be a boilerplate as long as it's under X square footage, as long as it's within these, you know, overhang rules, and it's flush to the roof, then no building permit is required. So it bypasses any of the building permit side of things. And that letter, we've actually had great success working through a lot of different municipalities and having that be adopted. So,
Can you talk to HRM?
yeah, they're one of the ones that we're trying to get through to. Yes. Yeah.
You know, I'll say that maybe this is a challenge more so, not on the rooftop, but certainly on the ground mount side, is that there's a view of renewable energy infrastructure and sort of painting it with the same brush as other types of legacy infrastructure buildouts tied to non-renewable resources. I think that's a bit of a challenge, is that communities are saying, oh, here's another energy infrastructure requirement. When we look at some of those legacy energy infrastructure that had abandonment issues, things like that, I think we're getting painted with the same brush here, when in fact there's fundamental differences between renewable energy infrastructure and the commercial life and the ability to repower, for example. All those things do not exist in the build out of other types of legacy non-renewable energy infrastructure. So I think that's a conversation I'm seeing at the RM level. And I think there's a lot of potential myth busting that needs to be done to say, no, we're not like other energy developments in terms of how much we tax the existing infrastructure, and in terms of end of life considerations for the repowering and continued benefit of those assets and infrastructure into the grid. So.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, and I always try and say, yes, you know, solar's generating electricity, but it's also a home improvement. How would you treat a kitchen improvement? You know, it's also an electronic device. How would you treat an electronic device? So one of the things I love in Alberta is that the Alberta Recycling Management Authority is actually moving forward with their electronics recycling program, and they just lumped solar in with all the other new technology. And so it wasn't a big deal. You know, it didn't have to be a big deal. They just said, hey, let's throw solar into this electronics recycling pilot we're doing anyways. And so they were actually having some fun with it, and we've been having a lot of good dialogue. And you know, we don't have to have a whole separate conversation about solar as if it's kind of just this my giant energy energy thing to deal with. It's actually an electronic. And you know what? We've been recycling electronics for quite a while now. So it's nice to see there are some people willing to have a more nuanced conversation about which category it fits in for different purposes, right?
We've explored some different permitting considerations. Are there any size limits or income limits that you could speak to briefly about rooftop solar installation projects in your province? I know that we've also done that throughout our conversation as well.
Mine are easy. I mean, British Columbia has the 100 kilowatt cap on net metering for BC Hydro and 50 for Fortis territories. That's on the AC side per meter. There's been some creative ways around that of having multiple meters on a site, but there are no income limits, no any of that side of things. You're supposed to try to right size your system. They tried to get that through the Utilities Commission, and then that got denied. So you can oversize your system. You'll get paid out at the current rate, which is 9.9 cents a kilowatt hour at the end of the year. So you can overproduce, but I believe that they'll fight back on that and try to get that to the wholesale rate in the future. So.
So as I mentioned, for residential projects, there's a 27 kilowatt AC size limit. You've got the annual consumption limit. In terms of commercial net metering, you can go all the way up to 1 megawatt, which is yet to be done. The previous limit was 100 kilowatts, and there's a few of those. I suppose I think that's about it, really. It's fairly simple.
Yeah.
In Saskatchewan, when they were looking at it's 100 kilowatt is the limit on net metering, and above that it was a power generation partnership program. But the 100 kilowatt limit is interesting. Saskatoon Light and Power actually has a 1 megawatt limit for net metering, and there's some much larger commercial industrial installations that have been built within the city of Saskatoon. But in Saskatchewan, the residential and rural customers are within one rate class. And what was happening is in the rural areas, a lot of these installations were commercial farming, and they would be right up at the 100 kilowatt limitation. And that was actually driving the average up to sort of 10 kilowatts when the residential projects were, typically much smaller than that. So again, there was significant uptake in that, especially on the rural commercial side of things. I think one of the challenges when you looked at who was participating in the program and who were some of the first adopters, it did tend to be people or businesses that were, quote unquote, wealthier. And that actually became a topic in the public space to say that, residential solar is just for, wealthier and higher median income people. Again, I think there's a huge opportunity here with low income housing to put in virtual net metering and get really creative in terms of how we can deploy solar and micro generation so that it does benefit lower income housing and people that are economically at risk. I would love to understand where maybe this is being done in a more fulsome way in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, well, I know we were advocating for some of those equity components, and I did see the Canada Greener Homes Grant is being redirected towards low and median income folks in its new iteration later this year. So hopefully that will address some of those affordability concerns. It sounds like the feds were probably hearing that from a lot of folks. I do think that there are a couple pieces I haven't mentioned yet on this topic in Alberta. So we do have small micro generators, which is under 150,000 kilowatts. And then we have the large micro generators, which is everyone over that to 5 megawatts. And so they are treated a little bit differently, but they are all to conform to the sort of consumption limit that was mentioned, where it's based on your annual consumption or your annual use. There are a couple of exceptions to that. We're following a lot of interesting AUC proceedings lately because there are different distributors who are sizing and requiring different things from the folks who are doing the design. And there are some interesting examples. Recently, there was a farm that was allowed to oversize because their size was based on an average over, I think it was the past 3 or potentially 5 years. And that average was very high compared to the previous year, but very low compared to other years. And it was a farm that really was seeing drought some years and it didn't have drought other years. And so its electricity usage was extraordinarily variable. And so the AUC came out with a decision and really reiterated a 2019 statement that they put out, which is essentially when sizing a microgeneration array, the idea is to incentivize people to generate their own electricity through renewables. And so because of that, they were allowing quite a bit of leeway in terms of how you estimate the size of the system. So that was quite an interesting ruling to watch, and we did intervene on that one just as an observer, actually, to watch how they decided that. So that was fascinating. The other piece I wanted to add is Alberta does also have the small scale generation regulation. And when I called the government of Alberta a while ago and I said, hey, you know, we're hearing a lot of concerns about the cap on production and the fact that folks can't overproduce and the fact that they want to and they can't. And they said, well, that's what the small scale generation regulation was originally created for, was to allow essentially microgenerators, if they want to, they can jump through a few more hoops and they can overproduce. I said, well, I don't think many people realize that. So what we did was we had a session at the Solar Show last year, and folks can find that session on our YouTube channel now. So if they are under 5 megawatts and hey, they want to overproduce, they can watch that session on our YouTube channel about the small scale generation regulation. Theoretically, they can use that to overproduce. I haven't seen a lot of folks do it successfully, but a couple community generation projects are. I think the Métis Nation went through that process. Innisfail, town of Innisfail is going through that process now. Essentially, they're wanting to set up 2 to 3 kilowatt system, and they want to be able to overproduce. So they're using that regulation instead of the microgeneration regulation. And so that's a unique one here, I think, in Alberta. I'm not sure if I've heard about that elsewhere.
Thanks, Heather. That answers Juan's question in the question and answer as well. So that's perfect starting point. We did talk about the cap in Alberta being flexible, and if they were interested in figuring how to do that, take a look at our session. This one is also a quick one to you. How are microgenerators different from distributed generators in Alberta?
So I think Brian, Erwin, and James can help me out here, but I often hear the term distributed energy in the very same way. Basically, if you're not a power plant, you're kind of distributed. Is that how you folks understand it? Because I know there's different lingo depending on the different jurisdictions. So maybe you guys can comment a bit further when you hear about distributed energy. Does that incorporate all residential and commercial, also industrial potentially, anything that's not essentially utility scale or power plant in nature?
Yeah, I'll maybe, and I'm going to look for backup from Brian here. I think it is a function of where you're tying in. Are you actually tying into the commercial panel at the residence or at the business? Is it a behind the meter into the panel interconnect versus connecting directly into the distribution system? So I think those are some distinctions here in terms of the voltage that you're tying into and the size of your system. But it does sort of lead into the facility requirements on the distribution side in terms of whether they need to upgrade transformers or not, and therefore sort of the capital cost and the impact of where you're tying in. And that can be, in some cases, a barrier to entry if the utility, for example, is trying or looking to put a lot of that capital cost on their side onto the cost of integration into the grid. And I've seen that be a barrier for adoption. But yeah, that's a interesting piece, and love to hear from the others here in terms of what they think.
Yeah, distributed energy resources, to my understanding of it, has always been something that is closer to the load than a utility scale application as well. So it can be a small run of the river project that's feeding the community that's local, but not a 10 megawatt plus kind of utility scale solar farm that then needs to tie in to the high voltage line and down and distributed through the regular transformation grid. So yeah, essentially microgen is a DER essentially in my definition of it.
I suppose I would agree wholeheartedly. It's the difference between centralization and decentralization. So
Thank you. Here's a question from David. Tax on solar PV production opens a can of worms. David says, my system covers my yearly electrical bill with a 125 to 250 credit. If I was taxed on that profit, then I can deduct the cost of my solar PV over 10 years. I would be way ahead with that deduction. How does that affect that tax model? If someone is able to answer.
Well, the problem is you're looking at it from just the overage is what you're looking at it from, whereas they would look at it from the entire generation value of the asset. If you're looking at an asset, you have to look at what it's producing, and then if you're going to write down that asset, you have to take into account all of what it's producing, not just your end of year overage from that power production. So again, we're not tax accountants on this call. Your best option is to talk to a tax accountant if that is something that is being implemented in your jurisdiction. We have lots of models that are brought in, and they all have the asterisks of contact your tax accountant to figure out how this works for your specific application, because it is variable. It is whether 50% of your house is also a home-based business. There's just a whole lot of different things you can run into, and I don't like to try to give tax advice on a live webinar. So yeah, talk to your local tax accountant if you do run up against that.
Yeah, super interesting. And also, I do recall we actually have a blog on our website looking a little bit at some of those federal tax incentives for businesses that might be doing that, because there are a couple of creative accounting options that the federal government has given businesses who are adopting solar. And so that's quite interesting to look at. And yes, do search back in our blog for a summary of that, because I just happened across that this year and discovered that the feds have apparently been incentivizing that for a while, and I didn't even know about it. So I was a little embarrassed, but we quickly did up a blog about that component. But yeah, it would be a whole different situation if you were talking residential.
Yeah, the commercial ITC has been technically in place since budget of last year, but it hasn't gone through royal assent or the final applications of it. They just got through third reading. It's Bill C-59 if you're tracking it. But there's a lot of things going on in Parliament with filibustering bills trying to get put through right now until budget time. So CanRIA is a great resource of where tracking that ITC and its progress through the different chambers of government. Erwin, I don't know if you had other details on that, but
No, thanks, Brian. And yes, our federal director, Fernanda Melo, has been on that file in terms of following that investment tax credit, which is 20% at a minimum and up to 30%, which again is just a way of incentivizing business to adopt clean energy and clean energy solutions there. So that is certainly something we like to see. Investment tax credits, all things being equal, are much easier to administrate than things like the Greener Homes program and some of those other things. And so once that becomes embedded in the tax code, that just allows it to sort of continue on in a much more, I'll say, confident way in terms of the businesses and business confidence in that sport.
Just to clarify, I wasn't really referring to the ITC, but I am excited to hear what you have to say about that. I was referring to an old accounting piece that's in legislation from a while back, which allows folks to write their solar array off in a very beneficial way. So it was a
Yeah.
little bit different, but I think it's really neat that there's also some new opportunities coming on the business side of things. I did notice that ITC, like, it doesn't look like it's going to apply to non-tax paying entities like nonprofits and whatnot. So I hope
That
that
that's
changes.
coming this year.
Oh,
So
thank
that's
God. Okay.
but it is at maximum. To his previous point, it's 10 to 15% as opposed to 20 to 30%
Yeah.
for non-tax paying entities. It's there's a different name to it. There's three different names. There's one for tax paying entities, one for non-tax paying entities, and one for manufacturing
Wow.
facilities. So
What a
there are
relief.
those are coming, but it will likely still need the same budget cycle to get into royal assent or law, if you want to call it that, as to what we're going. So are you talking about capital cost allowance write down,
Yeah.
Heather?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah, CCA rules have been in place for a while. This year they changed from 100% write down to 75%, and it's 75% this year and next year. But if you want to do any research, it's capital cost allowance write down for solar, which is an accelerated write down of a commercial asset for taxpaying entities.
Yeah, thank you. That's the name that's on that blog. And
Yeah.
I love to hear that the advocacy is working because, when that first ETC announcement came out, I didn't see anything about schools, hospital, nonprofit. There was nothing there for the little guy. And I was just so worried about that. So it's wonderful to get that update from you folks to hear that there's something happening there for the non-tax paying entities. Because I know we have no programs in Alberta that are currently supporting those entities for solar.
Okay, let's ask one more, or let's answer one more audience question. Chris asks, is there a way to appropriately size a system for a customer who is new to a property with no history of consumption? Or how is it done if this is the situation?
Yeah, actually, that's a situation I was in myself. So I used to live in a condominium. We didn't pay our own electricity bills. That was all through our condo corporation. And then we moved to a home, and the solar installer we worked with had a very standard rate that would be applied based on our situation. So I would say definitely hit up the solar installers in our directory who work in your area, because they'll know what the customary size is. That said, maybe the folks on this call want to speak to that more specifically. But I know I was allowed to have a 7 kilowatt system on a row home for 4 people in Edmonton, and that was with no prior history. That was just a standard amount here.
I can tell you how British Columbia does it is they take like buildings in that area, similar square footage, similar location, heating profiles, and then they give you an estimate if you haven't been there for more than a year. So they just take an assumption and you can apply for it as long as it's reasonable assumption. They generally pass it. They're not looking at reinventing the wheel, but if you're trying to put something on that is double the average of someone in your area, they're going to call you on it. But if you're within 20% of your neighbor, you're going to be fine.
I should mention, and James, maybe you can elaborate, but they will also look at how many electrical appliances you have, right? So if you have an electrical vehicle, they'll be able to give you a bit more. If you have an air source heat pump already installed without a natural gas backup, you'll be able to have a larger size system if all your other appliances are electrical. So a lot of those factors will be contributing to the sizing that they give you.
Yeah, I think this is a very difficult question to answer because it's sort of like how long is a piece of string? It's going to depend very heavily on what region you're in and the power consumption profiles of all of those places. Back when Nova Scotia Power had control over, well, historically you could only do 110% of your historical usage. That was the maximum size before 2022. And something they did allow you to do was submit, say it was a new build, you could give the square footage of the house, you could tell them all about the heating equipment, whether it's heat pumps or electric baseboards, that kind of thing. And they would generally, if you provide enough information, rubber stamp it. I'm not 100% certain if they did any behind the scenes analysis on it or just asked you to provide enough info to say this seems reasonable. But it's generally more of a sort of grace rule to get past. And yeah.
That's a good point about the regional position, because I was told that in northern Alberta, you're going to size an array a little bit bigger than in southern Alberta because you need a little bit more to produce the same amount of energy. And also, of course, depending on the tilt of your roof, if you've got a west-facing roof rather than a south-facing roof, you're going to need a little bit more, your size a little bit bigger to produce the same amount of energy or of electricity. So it'll definitely be roof dependent as well as region dependent. There's also the Alberta Solar Cost Calculator, and it factors in all of these different things. It's on the Municipal Climate Change Action Center website, and we have an Economics of Grid-Tied Solar PV course that tells people how to use that calculator, available for download if people are interested. And it'll kind of help you as well with sort of looking at those average size components. But I always say, talk to a solar installer. If they can't give you some of that information, then there's something wrong.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of their main bread and butter, is helping you out with those things.
I will say to a couple points here. I mean, I know of residential systems here in the city that are like a 17 kilowatt system, which is absolutely huge. But obviously the utility has to do that integration study and approve that amount of generation under kind of a worst case scenario. And it was approved. I think that, and it may have changed, I believe at one time there was a cap. You had to sort of stay within 100% of your annual consumption. I believe there was a bit of grace around that and the ability to carry over excess into the next year. I don't know if that still is in place. But for this particular individual, they absolutely plan on getting an electric vehicle, for example. And so if they're ultimately able to put in that larger system, and if they do produce in excess of 100% of their annual consumption in terms of the cap, probably what they're doing is just giving free excess power into the grid. So there's an incentive for them to do things on the consumption side, ultimately to not give away free power for the system that they've installed. So I think to a degree that could be self-correcting. But I will say to Brian's point, the amount of residential solar penetration in Saskatchewan is, and I haven't seen an update here, but the last time I looked, 0.5%. So roughly, I think 2,000, 2,500 installations for a customer base of 400,000 residential customers. So again, from a grid penetration perspective, we're far, far below any type of concern, really, I think, on the part of duck curve limitations.
Yeah, really interesting points. I guess in Alberta, you would not have that same scenario, Erwin, where you're giving anything free back to the grid, because you would be generating more, which is why they're quite strict about electrical vehicle sizing here. We do have a blog about that. You can't incorporate the electrical vehicle into your size unless you already have the purchase agreement in Alberta, because they don't believe kind of futures. They say, we'll believe it when we see it. Or you can scale up your system at that time. Same with the heat pump, you have to have the bill of sale, or if it stands alone, if you have a natural gas and a heat pump, then you have to have a full year's usage to demonstrate that you're actually using the heat pump before they'll let you incorporate it. So really interesting, but like you said, it depends on how your incentives work and whether there's actually going to be a credit generated through that overproduction or not, right? And how it affects your bills. That's super interesting to think about in different regions.
Let's move briefly from the installation side to the supply chain side. Rochelle asks, is there more initiatives coming for supply chain transparency in solar panel materials, manufacturing, and assembly?
I wish, but actually I was just I was just about to contact this lady today because there's this Global Electronics Council, and I wanted to contact them to find out if they're doing any solar supply chain work because there's not a huge amount. I know that there are, a few provisions, but as with any electronic device, there's not a huge amount of supply chain monitoring happening. I did talk to a manufacturer recently. She was kind of neat. She's from the Philippines. She worked in Indonesia and elsewhere. And she was explaining to me that when the US put in place a whole bunch of tariffs and whatnot, and also stipulations that certain products couldn't come from certain regions where they suspected there might be slave labor in use, her company, which was European, it was based in Europe, contacted her and put her in charge of tracing their solar products to see where the original parts came from and to verify that they weren't from the regions of China where there was some suspected slave labor occurring. So it was really interesting to meet the person who actually had to go and dig as a response to the regulations in the US. But I wish we could just see like a little fair trade label like you see on your bananas. Like, wouldn't that be easier if you could spot a label like that? I'm going to let Brian, though, comment further because I don't know as much supply chain as he would.
Yeah, I have to be a little bit careful of what I say because there's some ongoing things, but um, I can tell you that the manufacturers are heavily invested in this right now. They've all had to go through it from the US perspective. We are working with one manufacturer that we are already 5 layers back into the distribution chain on, making sure that there is no forced labor required, even though governmentally it wasn't a requirement. Legally as of yet, except for one blurb in the Canadian Border Service Agency Act that says that you shall not procure product that uses forced labor. There is a Forced Labor Provision Act that is coming into effect very soon that is requiring transparency. Ahead of that, there have been some product that has been detained to this point to prove forced labor has not been used in the application of it. So there will be more news coming on this topic very shortly, either within the next week or so. But I have to be very careful of what I say on this topic right now.
Well, super interesting to hear, Brian. And a question, obviously, I have an international development background, so it's a question that I think about all the time. And of course, we also get questions about, the greenness of manufacturing. And so one of the things that Solar Alberta has done just this past year to try and move this conversation along is we have a new category on our directory. So when people come to our directory, if they're looking for businesses that have various certifications, for example, do they engage in social procurement? Are they certified B Corp? These are folks who are thinking actively about this forced labor concept. They're thinking actively about the greenness of their manufacturing. They're thinking about the life cycle component. You can now screen for companies that are certified in different ways on our directory to help this issue along. I realize it's a really long process for anyone in the electronics sector to get into because it is such a global supply chain that we're dealing with, and there are so many mysteries when you go international. I know I asked a manufacturer the other day, he contacted me, he said, hey, I'm looking to connect. And I said, great. Where are your products made? And he said, oh, he told me where they're made, but what he didn't tell me is so like he was telling me where things were constructed, but he didn't tell me like 2 steps back or 3 or 4 steps back.
Oh.
And that's what you're getting at, Brian, is the multiple steps before that sort of putting it all together piece. That's very important.
Just as a note, I mean, we're 100% for making sure that there's no forced labor in the supply chain. This is a great initiative. But what the government needs to be careful on is exactly when they interject it and when they start holding product at the border. They need to give the manufacturing companies time to have put together all the documentation, because by the time it hits the border, trying to go back 6 layers into the distribution chain is virtually impossible without holding up today's newspaper and someone digging into the earth, right? So having that warning as to when it's being implemented and the actual documentation requirements of what are needed and a standardization of what is required to prove. Because let's face it, an affidavit from a company stating that they don't use forced labor is very flimsy at best, unless they can prove that all the way up the chain, right? So again, we're 100% for this initiative, making sure that there's no forced labor involved in any of the supply chain. But we do feel that there needs to be some transparency on what the rules and regulations are and when they're going to start holding product, as some people have been caught with this currently.
Much needed work, yeah. We could do a technical question next. In Edmonton, they use HOT 2000 or engineer stamp load calculations to calculate future load. Would anyone know if there are other jurisdictions that have similar requirements for justifying loads?
Not that I'm aware of in Nova Scotia. As I mentioned, you have the right to install whatever size system you want, so there's no need to prove future usage. You just got to make sure you get it right.
Yeah, BC's is much more archaic. They use like systems in the region. That's about it.
Okay. Chris asks, can you provide insights into the challenges and opportunities for entry-level professionals, like Chris himself, seeking employment in the rooftop solar industry? Are there specific skills or qualifications that employers in the rooftop solar industry prioritize when hiring new graduates?
I
This
can
question
talk
has,
about this, but
yeah,
sorry.
this question has James written all over it. So
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just introduce one topic and then you can take it home, James. But we ran a solar installation training program recently, and there was a lot of tension because there aren't a lot of rules in Alberta when it comes to installations, but there is one rule, which is that your installation is not going to be grid connected if you don't have an electrician sign off on it, a real electrician, a certified one. And a lot of people don't like that, apparently. So I would say the number one thing if you want to get into rooftop installations is you kind of have to be willing to become an electrician. A lot of our members don't require that you be an electrician. They will train you and they'll pay you while they train you, which is actually a pretty good deal. But if you're not willing to become one, rooftop companies rarely want you, because what can they do with you unless you're willing to actually go all the way through and be a support to the team in that way. So it's interesting that you asked that question, because the willingness to become an electrician is something that a lot of our members are looking for in an installer specifically. That said, there are a lot of other jobs related to the solar sector, and we actually have a whole section on our website, and we push out every Wednesday solar jobs from all of our members. And you'll see that solar installation is only one of many solar related jobs. So if you're not willing to become an electrician, there's a lot of other options available to you. Just check them out on our solar jobs roundup every Wednesday. But James, yeah, you better get into the weeds here, because this sounds like a fun one for you.
Okay, fair enough. So in Nova Scotia, yes, everything has to be signed off by an electrician. But electricians don't like to do everything. So there's racking, inverters, there's handling solar panels, basically everything from the Grand Trunk cable down. That's all the electricians' work. But there's still a lot of hardware that needs to get on the roof. And it's more of a trade than people would give it credit for. The other problem you have is when you go through I guess, college programs or things like that, the solar industry has changed so rapidly that sometimes what they're teaching, even though they made it a couple of years ago, is slightly out of date already. That's a kind of a problem for the people developing programs for students. I can tell you that my company likes to hire tradespeople, so carpenters, mechanics, ex-military, people with who aren't afraid to work with their hands, lots of practical knowledge, and the willingness to get on a roof. Fall arrest is essential. Safety is essential. And if you're looking for, work as a solar installer, you should definitely get your fall arrest. You can do it online now before you apply, and it shows initiative. I suppose the other side of things would be sales. Not many companies get big enough to require multiple salespeople, and that again is another fledgling industry. Tricky one, right? Do you do door-to-door sales? Do you do I'm stumbling all over myself here. Practical skills for installers and people skills for salespeople. That's what you want. Wish I had someone to bounce this off of.
That people skills piece is so important because with other construction trades, often they'll be in a community before the people move in, so they're there building the home. There's no neighbors around, especially if they're in a greenfield area. But solar is often coming in after the people are already around. And I recall reading that the number one reason that people will install solar on their roof is if their neighbor has installed solar on their roof. So if you have solar installers and salespeople who are personable, the chances of all the neighbors meeting them and liking them are pretty high. And I will say that I'm not going to talk about who my installer was, but it was interesting to see, just by being friendly to all my neighbors, it seems that all my neighbors have gone and used the same installer without any endorsement from me. And so it's quite fascinating how that people skills piece matters a lot more, it seems, in the solar sector than in some of the other trades where you're not interacting as much with neighbors and you're not coming on kind of late in the game. So that was something I was just kind of reflecting on lately with that construction piece.
Definitely. Those are some great insights, Heather and James. We can move on to Jayesh's question. Which benefit program in Alberta would be most advantageous to the owner of an existing or newly purchased home, as well as any existing offices or commercial buildings? So residential as well as commercial.
I'm just curious what they mean by benefits program. Maybe they mean incentive program, so like a grant or like a Canada Greener Homes grant. So maybe I'll just touch on that briefly. So the Canada Greener Homes grant is on pause right now, and hopefully we'll see that return. But it is going to be a different program when it comes. I think I heard it was for low and median income folks going forward. In Alberta, the main incentive program or benefit program we have right now is called the Clean Energy Improvement Program. And that's a low interest financing program that's offered through a number of municipalities right now. If you go to myceip, myceip.ca, you can see if your municipality is offering a low interest financing program. Edmonton is rolling theirs out this summer in full. They had a pilot last year. Calgary already went and rolled theirs out. I think they're rolling out a commercial program next year. At least that's their intent. And there are a lot of smaller municipalities that have actually gone ahead of Edmonton and Calgary on this one. And so if you want to check myceip.ca to see if your municipality is offering low interest financing, that is a wonderful program. I think it's here to stay. We were talking earlier about the political volatility of a lot of programs. I will tell you, the CEIP program, which is known in other jurisdictions as PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy, the CEIP program was first drafted when the Progressive Conservatives were in government. It was then refined and consulted on when the NDP were in government. And it was enacted when the UCP were in government. So it has withstood the test of time. I think it's here to stay. And it is a municipally driven program. So if you do not have it, you need to ask your councillors to get a CEIP bylaw and to roll out the CEIP program, because it is going to be the best incentive for residential and hopefully eventually commercial solar in Alberta for the long haul.
Thank you, Heather. Let's answer one last question to fill up the session. What are the main reasons folks, so that means individuals or businesses slash commercial in your jurisdiction are opting to install solar?
I'm doing this. The money. It's Alberta, baby. It's all the dollars and cents. I can't tell you how few conversations I have had since starting here about the environment and how many I have had about their return on investment. I would say 95% of people calling Solar Alberta are interested in the money and reducing their utility bills, and about 5% of them care about the climate. So that's where I'm at with the questions I get. I would say a lot of them see the climate impact as a nice secondary benefit, but they are first and foremost in it to reduce their utility bills, which are ever on the rise here in Alberta. So that's generally what we get calls in about. I'm curious about the other folks, though. Maybe you've got more raging environmentalists in BC, Brian.
We get a lot of retired oil guilt moving this direction, that people retire from Alberta and want to put some solar on their roof. But no, I mean, nobody's going to do it currently from a past the early adopters, which I started in the industry in 2005, and my first system had a 100-year return on investment. So that person was doing it purely for environmental power consent. Like, they were doing it for a whole host of other reasons that weren't financial, but that is the environmental socioeconomic impact are purely secondary to a growth market. We need the finances to make sense, and then you can have your market growth after that, and all the ancillary benefits. But yeah, I mean, we're less expensive than the local utility in almost every aspect, except for small commercial, where commercial users are paying 7 cents a kilowatt hour in BC. Very hard to compete against that from a solar perspective with the amount of sunlight we get here and cost of install and all that sort of stuff. But from a retail residential application, it's that, and it's also reducing your burden cost as you're retiring. So if you have a fixed income and you're making money today, and you're going to retire in the next 2 or 3 years, you can fix your utility rate to zero for your retirement, right? So that use your capital today to save money later is another application that people are doing for fixing and reducing their fixed costs as they move into a retirement perspective. So yeah, those are kind of the two key demographics that are working on it, is the people wanting better return on their investment. And then you do have the fringe environmental people that were going to do it anyway. But let's face it, the market, you saw the graph of where the market was in 2012 and earlier. We were not a large part of the radar until financing made sense through this entire project process.
Yeah, that's that's a great point, because ultimately the utilities are seeing cost pressure here as well, in terms of the age of their infrastructure, their need to recapitalize their assets. And the question is the rate increases that we're seeing on the utility keeping pace with inflation, or as a matter of fact higher than inflation? And so you start to really look at that trajectory of solar costs and residential solar, and those costs have come down, I believe, somewhere in the order of 80 to 90% since 2010. I mean, they've come down substantively, and so you hit that crossover point where if I can invest in something and I've got a return on that investment that is 10 years or less than 10 years, it simply makes good financial sense for me to put my dollars towards that. I think there is maybe a bit of a capital cost challenge, and people just don't think of capital cost versus operating costs as a trade-off. But then again, pace programming and other ways of managing that in terms of through your taxes over time, or with low interest loans, those are all ways to sort of bridge that. But again, I think residential solar and commercial solar, to a degree, time is on our side in terms of the fundamental business case for that. for the consumer and for saving on their energy costs.
I think people, there's sort of two ways to look about solar. One is from a financial investment perspective, and the other is from an energy independence perspective. And the financial investment perspective is, you know, a solar system typically takes between 9 and 12 years to produce enough power to pay for itself. All of the equipment is warranted often for 25 years, so it should pay for itself 2.5 times over its warranted lifespan. And the expected lifespan is actually unknown. I would say 35 years, but I think the studies show that if it lasts after the first 5 years, some of this equipment goes on forever. There's still solar panels from the 70s that are producing something. The other side of it is energy independence, and this is where people, I remember this lady we did a system for, and we put in a battery backup system, so it runs off solar and batteries, and it's grid tied. And she said that she doesn't want to import a single dirty coal-fired kilowatt hour from Nova Scotia Power. And I've watched the graph of that system through the winter, and she hasn't. The battery discharges at night and it recharges during the day, and she doesn't use any power from the grid hardly at all. And she got exactly what she wanted. And there's plenty of people like her that want to sort of be more independent. And I'm sure that must be the case in Alberta as well, if I know anything about Alberta.
But I think that's why solar is taking off here in such a big way. It's kind of, well, it used to be politically neutral because it didn't matter if you were right or left wing in Alberta. It used to be we were all interested in energy independence, and that the independence that solar brought. So the story's changed a little bit lately because we've had a pushback on renewables that was fairly un-Albertan and pretty uncharacteristic here. But I would say at the core, Albertans are interested in that same energy independence. And I think we will see a shift in our politics to reflect that again, because the current situation is very abnormal for our province, that's for sure.
Amazing. Thank you for the incredibly important insights and sharing some knowledge about navigating rooftop solar across Canada. I'd like to thank the panelists that were joining us today, James, Erwin, Heather, and Brian. And I would also love to thank Mackenzie, who is our Solar Alberta support, and all of you who have joined us today. Thank you very much for coming in and listening to what we have to say. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Preet. Thanks, everyone.
Bye for now.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.